Okay, so obviously we know that natural language understanding research is decades old, but it was really not really progressing that well for many decades, years and years, so 50s and so on, and maybe some synonyms, that kind of thing. But until machine learning kicked in, and obviously there were a few precursors to BERT, but BERT really was the huge, massive breakthrough that literally has just changed everything really about how computers understand the context and how words fit together. So BERT literally was trained on, for instance, Wikipedia. So the English version of Wikipedia. Hence, part of the reason why in international languages, maybe like Italian or Spanish or any other language than English, it probably wasn't seen as such a big deal because it probably hasn't, up until now, had a huge impact because primarily everything is rolled out in English first because the web is primarily, unfortunately, just based around the English language first and foremost. So there's that huge bias there in the web as a whole. So BERT is able to look at how words fit together in a small passage. So, it was initially a small passage, yeah. So it was able to understand, for instance, that a sentence that said, he's able to understand, for instance, that bank, when in the sentence he sat on the riverbank versus he went to the bank. One is a river, yeah, and water, etc. And the other one is a financial institute. So obviously, on its own, that single word, bank, could mean a few things actually. It could mean financial institution, it could mean riverbank, it could mean, oh, I'm banking on it, like slang to say, it's a certainty, that kind of thing. Because obviously natural language has many words that are what they call polysemous. They have like more than one meaning. So the big breakthrough obviously came from something called transformers and the attention mechanism that meant that with BERT, all the words surrounding, in, if you like, what they call a context window, were able to be looked at, and the important words in a particular sentence and how each important word relates to the other words in terms of weight and importance. That was able to be determined all of a sudden through machine learning, etc. So the initial BERT was super expensive from many aspects, computationally expensive, economically expensive, because obviously computers don't run themselves, electricity bills, the environment, and so forth, because it uses this thing initially called quadratic dependency, which means that every single word in a small passage has to look at that word compared with that, in the context of that word, and it just goes round. So it's really just squared, if you like. So hugely expensive, and it had limitations. And the initial BERT, obviously the Devlin paper, was released to the open source community, the natural language research community, and they went absolutely nuts with it and extended it and made it better. That was a year before, obviously, Google released what they call, BERT in the real world, in production. But even at that stage, BERT in production was really only used very, very sparingly, and really only to understand nuance. And, years ago, we always said in SEO, oh, Google strips out all the stop words because obviously they don't have that much importance. The, and, it, of, but, etc. Loads and loads of stop words. But eventually, they started to add them back in. This was before BERT anyway, because sometimes sentences just don't make any sense without, and certain entities don't make sense, like the Who. The Who's a band, yeah, but if you took the out, you'd have like Who. So I think that was a while ago anyway that they started to literally add stop words back in, although they probably didn't weight them very highly in the first place, or even currently they probably don't weigh them very highly. But all those little words, they are, if you like, the contextual glue. And if you saw the example that they provided when they announced that BERT was being rolled out in production, the nuance there, even just as a layperson reading that article, the nuance between what one result was and what the other one was really hard to pick up. And it really was. I saw a few people write, "Oh, BERT's all about stop words." No, it's not. But a sentence, a natural sentence, a non-keyword-esque sentence, needs all these little small words to hold a conversation, a natural language together. So actually, it was almost like suddenly all of those bits and pieces were able to be understood in the context of the important words and the important meanings. But, as I say, it was hugely expensive. Even BERT's creator was, I can't remember where he said it, but he said, it's a nice to have. It's really a nice to have. It's just it's only ever going to be used on small things because it's just too expensive. And actually, I would say that even now, I know that Bing have said things like, well, we use BERT-like models in every query, but I would suspect that there are times in commercial search engines where it's like taking a hammer to a nut. That's an English saying to say overdoing something. A lot of the time, you may have like AI and machine learning solutions, but you don't need to use them, yeah? Because things are obvious, like navigational queries. They're really obvious. Why would you need machine learning to like go to an ASOS website or things like that? Yeah. So I think it's for things that could be ambiguous, an ambiguous sentence built up from like polysemous words with multiple meanings, etc. Maybe some things like sentiment analysis, etc. Because obviously BERT is like just a framework that people can extend upon to do all the different downstream tasks like sentiment analysis and, textual entailment and next sentence prediction and so forth. So it's just a springboard, and that's what the research community did. And obviously prior to Google introducing what they called BERT, there were all these other models springing up all over the place, like Albert and, all the huge tech companies were coming on board, and you obviously had like the OpenAI things coming in, etc. And just pretty much every company that's huge in tech is using some sort of version now of BERT or a BERT-like model, So yeah, so that's kind of where it started from. As you say, you alluded to yourself mentioning how, in the Italian market, it probably was overlooked for quite a long time. And I think that's going to change a lot going forward, because they not only now have machine learning models in one language, but they now have, I know that Bing, for instance, or Microsoft is doing a lot of challenges around cross-language models. So the translation things are really, really huge. And obviously, everything that's going on in the world at the moment, you never more have you appreciated that actually it's really important for us to be able to understand each other's language and be able to translate things really, really well. But it's really hard because some languages don't translate directly. And I know that, I think it was Facebook that not too long ago produced a model that was able to, I think it was Facebook, they produced a model that was able to translate directly from, I think it was French to Chinese without having to go through English first, because I think what used to have to happen was everything used to have to be translated from one language into English and then translated back out of English and into the other one. So to cut out that middle step is absolutely huge. So I think going forward, regardless of whether it's Italy or any other territory, these nuances that come around with BERT and the more greater understanding of intent and context and etc. are gonna just keep getting more prevalent because of these cross language models in particular. And I know that we're going to come on to Mum, but Mum talks about the different languages that it's going to be available in and so forth. And I know that that's early days for that, but it's just another example of the great strides that are being made in scalable translation from one language to another in search. So, yeah. So passage ranking, I mean, passage indexing and passage ranking. I know that there's this whole the community, the SEO community went absolutely nuts when they called it passage ranking. Because, no, passage indexing, sorry. Because they were worried that it was going to be like a whole other index, etc. But it's to do with ranking, if you like. So there's been a huge amount of work on this of late, the past couple of years, if you like. And I think one of the biggest breakthroughs was again relating to the expensive nature of these machine learning language models, BERT in particular. I think BERT at the time, I'm not quite sure whether this has changed, but BERT had a 512 character limit on it. And that was at that point, it literally computationally so too expensive, it just wouldn't work, yeah. So Jimmy Lin, I think it was Jimmy Lin and another chap called, I think it's called Rodriguez, basically came up with something that said, look, it's just, in a lot of computing, this seems to be the norm. What they do is they literally break things down into small pieces and to solve a problem. So the obvious solution to try and use BERT on bigger documents was naturally just to break it up into bits, yeah, and the bits are the passages, yeah. So it means that passages are able to be understood more clearly and in the context when compared with the expensive nature of trying to look at a whole document. So, yeah, I mean, there's been quite a lot of other. I mean, obviously, passages as well are used for re-ranking, passage re-ranking and ranking. So the machine learning part of things traditionally has only been really used on the heavy lifting part of search, like the top K, if you like, the top, I don't know, 20, whatever, maybe more than that, top K re-ranking. So basically filter out everything that actually is below a certain quality threshold or which doesn't actually meet the query. The words are not in the document in the first place. I mean, obviously there may be some semantics that connect together phrases and so forth that synonymize certain things so that a word doesn't strictly have to be in a document because they understand that a car and motor are kind of the same thing, for instance. But the next stage is where the heavy lifting is after you've kind of disqualified those documents that are just not relevant at all. Yeah. So they just they're not even making the next stage of if you like, multi-stage ranking, yeah, ranking models. So then the likes of machine learning and passage indexing and so forth, passage re-ranking, kicks in where it becomes much more about fine-tuning and building a picture of how things might go together really well in the later stages of ranking, really understanding, just really, really fine-tuning that great set of search results. And obviously they're not perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. There's been a few other, there's obviously lots and lots of different papers now out there and lots of research into passage indexing and different ways to index with passages. What was really interesting about the paper the research rather that I looked at for the piece that you're talking about on Search Engine Land was around Zudan Dai, I think she's called, and she was talking about how potentially passages could be weighted and almost replace, I'm not saying that this has been done, almost replace like term frequency, by kind of looking at what's important in a passage in the context of everything else, and potentially looking at passage indexing as a way of dynamically pruning the index, i.e., are there what's in this document when you break it all into bits and so forth. And obviously, passage indexing, passage ranking, if you like, means that in reality for SEOs, search engines are able to look at parts of a document and in effect rank parts of a document independently of the whole document, and then maybe rebuild again. It's that whole like take it apart, look at all the bits, and then put it back together, So almost like able to look at the quality of the whole piece by looking at the parts of the pieces, because historically long documents have been like really, really hard to understand and rank. I mean, they're quite diluted. They can be quite diluted. And obviously there's a lot of blogs out there that don't really serve much purpose. They're not very focused. They're, a lot of experts write things, but they don't have SEO front of mind. So they're real experts, but they're not optimizing everything to a perfect structure of like, H1, H2, H3, etc., so forth, So maybe, whereas in the past, and even so now, things like semantic headings do help for search engines to understand what a page is about. If somebody doesn't have them, maybe the likes of passage indexing and passage ranking means that search engines are able to understand better what that page is about and what each part of it is about. Say you've got, I think Martin Split gave a good example. He said, look, we've got a page that's all about dogs and one paragraph that's about cats. Well, before the likes of passage indexing, we may not have even considered the small piece that's about cats because the page is about dogs. But now when we look at passages, we can maybe judge that one passage that may be amazing that's just about cats, and rise that to the surface, So again, I think it's one of those things, like BERT, it's not something that I think we're going to see overnight and say, hey, all of a sudden, there's not like a core update, which is massive drops off the scale and so forth. I think it's just as more and more data comes in, as more and more passages. I mean, when you look at, for instance, the likes of Bing, they've just gifted a huge set of click data from real queries called orcas. I know that Andrea from WordLift did some work with it. He went off and I mentioned it to him, and he went off and did something very practical with it immediately, as he does. So that is actually real queries that machine learning engineers can work with. And as more and more of that data is gifted, like Google's natural questions, and through the likes of I'm just trying to think what it's called actually. They've got various leaderboards. My mind's gone blank, but there's all the machine learning leaderboards out there where they try to get state-of-the-art natural language understanding. So that kind of gifted data means that you've got Google and all sorts of search engine engineers in the research side, and often practitioners as well, real search engineers, and commercial website, if you like, stroke search engine engineers, also using the same data sets, and academia, like all the universities like Glasgow and MIT and so forth, all working together to, using things like passages, passage data, etc. So the passages from search engines that are gifted, huge amounts of data sets on the likes of Hugging Face and so forth as well. All of it feeds in, and it's just one of those. As with anything about machine learning, it's really about confidence. The more data, the more the confidence. The more data, the more the confidence. So I think it's just going to keep increasingly like, well, what does this query mean? I mean, that's what the Orcas data set was really for. It was to say, what does this mean? Is an orca a whale, or is it a data set, or is what does a query mean? What is the intent behind? What is the highest intent behind an ambiguous head, an underspecified query? Yeah. So when I type into Google dresses, is it a commercial query? What do I want? Yeah. Is it blue dress? It's never going to be like blue dress, because obviously that query would be met by blue dresses. But the point is, the underspecified queries need intent mapping to them, and the data and the clicks, the longer tail, all the questions and answers and the passages all feed into that. Yeah. So it's just I think it'll just keep getting better and better, particularly on the areas, if you like, of fuzzy search, where it's a little bit vague, could mean many things. I think it will keep improving. I know that there's people out there that say, oh, it's going worse, but we're all looking at it from our perspective, not from maybe a nuanced perspective, different contexts and so forth. Obviously search is increasingly dynamic. I'm not saying it's going to be massively different. If I'm in one country, it's not going to be hugely different, but there will be some differences around what that local market wants. So I think it's easy for us to say, oh, search is not great, but we're looking at it from our perspective.